Everything. Okay, I think we are good to go. I think I saw that. Go
That
ahead,
looks
sir.
good. Welcome everybody to our committee meeting this morning. This is the Tracking and Communicating Outcomes Committee. I am Sarah O'Brien, OWEB's Executive Director, and until this group selects a couple of co-chairs, I will pretend to be co-chair today and facilitate the meeting. And then towards the end of the agenda today, we will ask for volunteers. And if that doesn't work, then somebody will get voluntold between meetings and we'll do it that way. I'm going to go to, oh, I have to do the script after all that. Um, I want to remind everybody that this is a virtual meeting, fully virtual, being streamed live on OWEB's YouTube channel and recorded for posterity. Folks watching on YouTube, meeting materials are on the OWEB website in the board and committee section. Committee materials are towards the bottom of the page, and you can click on the committee name and have access to the current meeting materials, as well as past meeting recordings, except this is the inaugural meeting of this committee. So you'd have to look at a different committee's meetings. I'll step us through the agenda quickly here, and then we'll go to introductions. Let me just pull it up. I want to say by way of introduction to, I'm excited about this committee, and I think the conversation that we had at the last board meeting about sort of the importance of strategic communications in our work and in OWEB's sort of role and mission is a key one, and one of the reasons that I'm excited to have this committee kicking off. I also want to point out to folks that this will, and we'll talk about this more later in much more detail, but this will be the committee home for OWEB's both monitoring and reporting grant programs and our internal work that we do to monitor and report on the outcomes of conservation investments around the state. And we've been looking for an opportunity to do some educational work with board members and really get our heads around that. But not very many people fund monitoring and reporting in the conservation world. And so this is a really important body of work, and I think we'll have a lot of cool opportunities to dig in and think about how the programs and sort of our internal monitoring and reporting roles and our external communications and those of our partners fit together in this forum going forward. So I'm going to go around and do first board, then staff, then partner introductions, just as I see folks on the screen, and then we'll go to public comment unless Nicole tells me otherwise. Let me see. First board member I see is Brian, and then after Brian, I'll call on Claire.
Hi, I'm Brian Staub with the U.S. Forest Service. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for making the audio work today. I realize that's kind of a hassle. Claire, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Claire Takella with the Natural Resources Conservation Service.
Thanks for being here, Claire. I keep thinking you're working from home and I could almost see you from my second floor of my house, but that's probably not true.
No, I'm here in the office full time.
I always think of you when I drive through Redland now. Mark Labhart.
Good morning, everybody. I'm actually on vacation. Pretty happy guy. I watched the Oregon State women win the Western Coast Conference title yesterday here in Vegas. So I'm pretty happy guy. So it was a great tournament. So
Robert Denmark. I was fooled by your virtual background. I just assumed
I am so jealous, Mark. We went last year.
Oh, well, it was a great. They beat. I'm not taking up too much time here, but they beat Gonzaga, which was, their number 4 seed. OSU was, and they beat Gonzaga, of course, the number 1 seed. So they won. They're going dancing. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for calling in from vacation, Mark. We did get apologies from Jamie McLeod Skinner, who has a previous commitment and can't make the meeting today. And I know we kind of fired these up quickly. Folks didn't get their board committee assignments very long ago. So I know that some conflicts probably will be unavoidable. And Liza Jane McAllister is also on vacation. Jesse Kirschner, I think, will be joining us just a few minutes late. So we'll ask her to introduce herself when she gets here. Nicole Bettinardi, do you want to kick off the staff introductions and then Courtney?
I sure can. I am not on vacation. I am in rainy Salem in the office as well. Nicole Bettinardi, I am the OWEB Executive Assistant and Board Liaison.
And good morning. I'm Courtney Schaff. I'm OWEB's Monitoring and Reporting Manager. I was on vacation last week and I am back to reality this week. And I will pass it off to Stephanie.
Good morning, Stephanie Page, Deputy Director at OWEB, and I'll pass it to Audrey.
Thank you. I'm Audrey Hatch, the Conservation and Outcomes Coordinator here at OWEB in the Salem office. Headed to Hawaii on Saturday, and I'll pass it over to Ken.
Hey everybody, my name is Ken Fetcho. I'm OWEB's Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator and Travel Liaison here in the Salem office. I'm born and raised in Las Vegas, Nevada, so have fun, Mark. I think that's
know
all
that, Ken.
set. Yeah. Running Rebels.
That's awesome. I'm going on vacation after legislative session is over, and I'm sticking with that for the time being. Partners, thanks for joining us today. Terry and then Andrea, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Terry Grigsby, and I'm the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. And I am here this morning just to listen in to what's going on. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, Terry. Andrea, nice rainbow.
Isn't it? That's from my house last week. Hopefully we'll see one later today. Andrea Kreiner, the Executive Director of the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts. And yeah, I'm here just to listen and wrap my arms around all of these new committees. And as you know, communication is very important to the partnership. So we hope to be partners with this committee.
Thanks, Andrea. I think that's everybody. Did I miss anybody? Nicole, you want to take us through a public comment opportunity here? I don't think we have any written comment, do we?
We don't have any written comment. Andrea, I know you mentioned that you're just here to listen. Terry, did you want to provide public comment this morning?
Not this morning, but thank you.
All right, well, that was easy. I don't believe we have anyone else online.
With the lack of other public members, we can be pretty confident there won't be any other public comment.
Nope, that is all. So I will hand it back to you.
Okay, so gang, Courtney is in charge of all things monitoring and reporting, as she said. I don't exactly know how you guys are splitting the effort on this, but some combination of Courtney, Steph, Ken, Audrey will be walking us through the next two big agenda items here. So starting with a high-level overview of the OWEB programs that fall within this committee's domain, and folks will remember part of what we requested from the board in a committee structure was just to have a place for every committee to check in, sort of report on program changes, ask for feedback, ask for kind of pre-review of funding decisions and program design and continuous improvement decisions. So we'll walk you through the stable of programs that are covered there. And then we'll walk through kind of near future work planning for this group. And that's where we welcome board's comments and questions on any part of this, but that's one in particular where we can see a couple different directions to take this committee and a couple different things that we definitely want to focus on in the kind of short to midterm. And then we're interested in hearing from board members what would you like more information on? What would you like to dig deeper into? What are some areas that you would like for this committee, given its mandate to be focusing on? In the last couple of minutes, I can, if we have time, share kind of a brief outline of a board charter. If we don't get to that, I'll just send out a draft charter between meetings, and then we'll revisit that coming up at the full board meeting at Lindsay McCleary's request and sort of tip. Nicole and I have been working on a shared charter for the three committees just to keep things super concise, and then like a short description of each of the committees under it. So we'll be sharing that with the board in the near future here in draft form. And then we'll invite folks as well to self-nominate or volunteer others for the co-chair role for this committee. It's a light lift, friends. Just check in quickly with us before the meeting and see the agenda. It doesn't require a lot of meetings. This committee will be meeting quarterly unless our workload kind of demands otherwise, and then we can make a decision whether to extend our meetings, do more frequent meetings, create a subcommittee. We have some options in front of us, but that's not something that we see on the horizon in the next couple of quarters here at least. So for the time being, I think this committee, the co-chair role should be a pretty light load, but you don't want me talking us through every single meeting like this. So I will welcome volunteers towards the end of the meeting. Any questions before we ask Courtney to kick it off? Anything else, members, that you wanted to make sure we get to today? We're looking forward to seeing you in April, so we're starting to get close, and you'll start getting materials from us soon here, or requests. Courtney, take it away.
And I will just kind of apologize to Ken and Audrey. I put this PowerPoint together after Steph sent me a template pretty quickly. So I will ask them to kind of fill in blanks of things I miss as I run through these. We're going to start by chatting about the monitoring grants and then run through the other categories. And one of the things, just high level overview for this committee, you know, you'll remember we just adopted some minor adjustments to the monitoring rules. So I think a lot of the other committees are going to be having some pretty heavy touches over the next probably year or so on different rules. We really don't see that at this time as this committee having any big lift related to rules or rules advisory committees or adjustments of rules. If we identify things as we're working together, we'll gladly take those and dive into them. But at least staff-wise, we don't see any of those kind of big lifts coming forward. All right, I have not been on Zoom very often, and I always accidentally hit the leave when I'm trying to share. There's the share button. There we go. I hit it. There it is. Successful?
We see it.
Boom, and I can't see any of you now. Oh. Can you hear me? I think I just muted myself. No, I didn't.
No,
Okay.
we can hear you, Courtney. I do also want to share for the benefit of board members that the formatting on this slide presentation is the same as the other committees. And what you're seeing is a reflection of us leaving Linda alone for a couple of weeks after she plowed through a board meeting and a budget presentation. So Courtney, everybody else, I don't think you saw the other committee meetings, but everybody else introduces by saying, Linda didn't get a shot at these slides because we were really hard on her in January and February, and she's catching up now.
And we can do things that are simple and basic.
We can. This is classic.
We don't always have to engage our amazing graphics person. So just so quickly, monitoring grants are, you know, funded through both OWEB's open solicitation and FIP awards. So twice a year, twice a biennium, the open solicitation monitoring grants are offered. So open solicitations cadence is twice a year, but we just do monitoring grants once a year, twice a biennium. I realize as I put the issues coming before the board related to monitoring grants is previewing funding recommendations. I think after I wrote that, I remember Eric Williams and I have connected, and based on the timing of when the open solicitation deliberations and evaluations come out, and the timing of these committee meetings, I don't actually think there will be an opportunity to preview open solicitation monitoring grants to the committees. But I think as we're all kind of finding this cadence, what Ken and I will find is how do we raise maybe pieces of the conversation that might pop up during the board meetings, whether there's project themes or funding themes or challenges we're hearing from the grantees on the ground. So as Ken and I work through the cadence and we work together, I'm sure we will be identifying things to bring to the board related to the monitoring grants. The monitoring grants are different than the open solicitation grants as they are reviewed by the Oregon Plan monitoring team. And again, that's just what we updated in the rules that were just adopted at the last board meeting. So all the open solicitation monitoring grants go to the Oregon Plan monitoring team, which is made up of state and federal partners. And then Ken is the project manager on those grants and writes up all those evaluations. For this biennium, the spending plan was 4.5 million. We actually awarded a little over that. There was an underspending with one grant cycle. I think it was within restoration. Ken might remember where they gave us a little bit of money so we could fully fund a chunk of projects that were recommended for funding. And currently, the staff recommendation that we've been talking about internally is to keep that pretty static going into next biennium, right around $4.5 million again. And I think I will pause there on the specific monitoring grants and see if Ken has any other details to add or if there's any questions from anyone on the board.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, just so that the committee members can understand the scale of our investment, at any given time, we have about 100 open monitoring grants across the state, and that's again funded through open solicitation. And we saw an increase when we started the FIP grant program because each partnership that's funded can submit, as you guys know, project applications for monitoring, and the majority of them do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
So I've got a question on, it says preview of funding of recommendations, but there's a committee that already makes that recommendation. So what role do we have in that definition of preview?
Yeah, great question, Mark. Thanks. So just like OWEB's other technical review teams, the Oregon Plan Monitoring Team comes up with that recommendation, and then they make that recommendation to OWEB staff so that that's not a public meeting, and then OWEB staff finalize that recommendation, executive team reviews those, and then it comes to the full board for a funding decision. For some of our grant cycles, we'll be able to kind of bring those preview of those board decisions to the committee so we can talk about these are the projects above the line, these are the projects below the line, these are concerns that we have that we might want to make the board aware of before they discuss in the full board. I think my understanding in my conversation with Eric Williams is because of the cadence of when we write up the evaluations for open solicitation and when they're published, I'm not sure the Restoration and Acquisitions Committee and this committee are going to get like a full preview versus like where we might do that for some of the grant programs. But I think as we navigate the committee structure, we'll be figuring out how to engage with the committee on those conversations. Sarah, anything else to add?
Mark, I'm not sure which committee you were serving on before because I only joined, I think, one of them. But this is pretty similar to the role the grants committee has been playing for as many of the grant programs as possible up till this point, and just kind of got swamped and overloaded given the number of programs that they were trying to play that role in. So that's part of the goal, is to kind of spread that final review and kind of check in and explanation in across, because we don't always have a ton of time with the full board to work through funding decisions.
Sounds good. Yeah, I was on the grants committee, so I was just wondering if it was.
Well, then you know what that was like.
Yeah.
This is like that.
Thanks.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And the next slide I'm going to go to is going to be very much different than those open solicitation and FIP monitoring grants. So the next category that is in the spending plan is the quantifying outputs and outcomes. And within that spending plan line, there's two grant types that Ken and Audrey work together to manage, and they're the telling the restoration story and effectiveness monitoring. Both of these programs have been delegated awards. Again, at the last board meeting, you saw Ken and Audrey talk a little bit about a telling restoration story that was finished and asking for some delegated funds to work with some grantees for new telling the restoration story grants. And so this is definitely one of the places I want to flag where we're looking to engage with this committee. There's definitely been discussion in the last few board meetings and feedback on, you know, who are our grantees, what are the outcomes we're working with on these grants, what's the goal and objective when we're funding them. So I think we're definitely envisioning spending some time bringing these ideas to this committee, discussing them, and also as we get into next biennium, just to discussing the pipeline of projects that we're working with, who the grantees are working with, the products we're thinking about. One of the things I wanted to share is we include in our annual PCS, or Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund application, just a couple paragraphs about the Telling the Restoration Story grants, some examples of products, and a map. And it's actually one of the areas where we've specifically received written feedback from our PCSRF application about how they appreciate OWEB's unique approach to like working to share more broadly the products of restoration and the data that we've collected over time. And it's been a specific positive call out in our application a couple times. The current spending plan for the board for the quantifying outputs and outcomes is $1 million. We've been having conversations internally among staff, and we're looking at reducing that going into next biennium to somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000, recognizing that we haven't spent all of those funds in the last couple biennia, and looking just to figure out how to reallocate those funds to support other programs. Any questions on the telling the restoration story grants, or anything to add, Audrey, that I missed?
Yeah, I would just add, Courtney and others, that I know in the materials for today, we talked a little bit about OWEB's strategic plan and tracking, and that there are several components or places in that strategic plan where the telling the restoration story model is actually called out. So along with broad awareness, along with ways to showcase examples of responses to emerging restoration challenges. So it aligns well with the strategic plan. Thanks.
Thanks, Audrey. Any other questions? So I think just the last thing I would say on these is Ken and Audrey have been doing a great job working with kind of a list of a group of grantees that are potentially going to be submitting applications over the next few months. And what I would envision is before we get to grant agreement on those projects, we'll be coming and updating this committee on what the projects are, what the intended products are, and just see if you have any questions about how we can continue to responsive to board's questions and bolster those final grant agreements and any products that we will be receiving from the grantees. All right. Effectiveness monitoring. So this is beyond our, project-specific monitoring that we would get through open solicitation grants. This is really broader landscape scale monitoring that's often occurring over many more years, bigger scale partners than a typical single project that we would see through open solicitation. A great example of this is the stage 0 work that you've heard about before in presentations, and that you are going to hear about in the next board meeting, thanks to some work that Ken and I have been doing with Brian. And I think one of the places that Ken and I are super excited to have a tracking outcomes and communications committee is to help us have these conversations about what are some other upcoming areas that we should invest in additional monitoring that's at the project scale, landscape scale. It was awesome. Brian, in one of his updates to the board, mentioned some projects he was working on. He and I then had some side conversations. And we've identified a really awesome opportunity to collaborate with many partners across the state on some monitoring work that really complements other investments we've had. So we'll definitely be using this committee as an opportunity to brainstorm, think about other ideas, and talk about where it makes sense for OWEB to invest in broader landscape scale monitoring to complement the work we're doing in the strategic plan and in other restoration work we're doing. Ken, anything to add here or questions?
Courtney, I don't know if you can see, but Brian's got his hand up too.
Okay, great. I can't see, so thank you. Brian.
Yeah, thanks for the information. I guess a question. You mentioned it's been $1 million historically per biennium, but you were recommending that to basically half of that moving forward. I guess I'd be curious about, hearing a little bit more on the thinking there about, I guess I heard some challenges with actually delivering on or seeing the need for that amount of money moving forward and having the projects and such there. But I don't know, it seems a little bit contrary to my experience where there seems to be a large interest and need from the restoration community on understanding outcomes, but sometimes a lack of ability to make the investments, especially over time, to actually answer the questions that the public and that resource managers appropriately have but sometimes I don't think there's reasonable expectations about what it actually takes to answer some of those questions in a scientific way. And so to the degree that we can have some investments that are pretty durable and stable, that would enable some targeted kinds of studies or monitoring to answer some of those questions, I think is something we ought to think about. So yeah, I guess in summary, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the thinking of reducing those kinds of investments, because I just don't see the questions going away. But
Brian, that's a great observation. And there's a couple things that Ken and Audrey and I were discussing, and then would open it up to them to add things. Is we did just kind of do this fairly significant investment in the Telling the Restoration Story grants through a delegated authority, and that pipeline of projects will probably get us well into next biennium, and we don't have other ones like necessarily queued up, and so that's some of the funding and then we're investing in asking the board to invest in Meadow Creek next month. And so we don't necessarily have new needs already identified. And so we were thinking, 500 to 600,000 would help us address new needs that emerge through next biennium. In some kind of retrospect, as I was thinking about prepping for this meeting and thinking about the needs and excited to use this committee, I think it's been at least 3, maybe 4 years where we haven't had a specific monitoring committee. And I think one of the downfalls of not having that committee is we haven't had a group of people to brainstorm with about how to invest the quantifying outcome spending plan line item. And so I think that has then played into us underspending those funds the last 2 biennium, because we haven't just had a group of board members to brainstorm with and think about the importance of investments. I'm really excited to see how we can use this committee and use that spending plan line item. But I'm also trying to be like super fiscally responsive, as I'm the manager of our federal funds and unsure about what our spending plan is going to look like next biennium. I think if we get halfway through the biennium and funding is more robust than we anticipated, we can always ask the board to identify categories where we would add additional funding to. And since this one is dialing back, if it looks like there are other opportunities for investments and we have the resources, we could always ask the board to add funding when we rebalance the spending plan in July of 26 to add funds here. Ken or Audrey, other things to add?
No, thanks, Courtney. It's exactly what we talked about as far as sort of why the reduced ask in the 25-27 biennium spending plan. The only thing I'd add is there's just a few other examples of how we've used these funds in past years. We did, several years back, did a statewide assessment of the CREP program. We have continued, you guys approved some of the small funding requests for the Middle Fork John Deere River IMW under this spending plan line item. And then also, and soon to come out, is the monitoring of above and below ground carbon and riparian condition for riparian plantings in the western part of Oregon. That'll be coming out. That's a partnership with the Nature Conservancy. So I just want to give a few other examples of how we've invested these funds in other restoration actions.
Thanks, Ken. Sarah, anything to add there? Everything I said was okay.
I share your excitement. Like, I feel like I'm getting up to speed on these programs, and so it's hard for me to be a good partner to the staff and the board in big meetings, trying to figure out like, what are the goals of this one? Like what, like Courtney said, where is the strategic investment? And I do think that creates a danger of underspending. And we've been wanting for a long time to do a deeper dive with a subset of board members on these programs to be able to really dig into exactly what Brian described, that we know demand is high, we know the need is high. We know not very many other people are funding it. And you know, we do need some strategic guidance to kind of help with our matchmaking role here.
Brian, any additional thoughts or questions?
No, that was super helpful. Thanks.
Great. And again, I'm really excited what we're going to bring to the board in April. And it's been really fun to work with a group of partners, really with a quick turnaround, to pull together some exciting work that complements other investments we've made. All right, the next
Court.
Yeah.
Real quick, before you move on, I would like to just point out that Jessie was able to join us. If you want to take a quick pause, we can introduce Jessie and then we can move on.
Yes, let us introduce
Assuming she's not having tech issues like the rest of us did this morning.
I am not having tech issues, but I am homesick, so I'm going to keep my camera off because I just cannot kick this cold that I've had for over a week. So, hi everybody, Jessie Kirschner, non-voting board member representing OSU Extension.
Thanks for showing up, Jessie. We'll take it easy on you.
Yes, welcome. Okay. Great, I'm back. Okay. All right, so the next area that falls within this board committee is strategic implementation area grants. So these are delegated funds, and this is a collaborative partnership with Oregon Department of Ag, where OWEB is providing funding for strategic information area geographies around the state that are identified by ODA. And the funds support engagement, technical assistance, monitoring, and just beginning this biennium, some restoration actions. So the cycles for these funds really vary depending on whether it's the monitoring funding, it's this technical assistance engagement, or restoration funds. These are all delegated. The current spending plan has about $1.5 million allocated, and we're looking at just a slight decrease in that funding level for 25-27. One of the unique areas about this program is there is a collaborative group called the SIA Managers Group that meets quarterly. It includes ODA, OWEB, ODF&W, and DEQ. And that group really works to help set the priorities for the program, talk about how much funding we're investing in each of those grant opportunities. And so as I was thinking about how to engage this committee on this program, and knowing that there is this other group that's heavily involved, I'm not really sure. I think it'll definitely be really important to help this board understand what is the strategic implementation areas, how are OWEB's funds being used, what does it actually look like on the ground for distribution and outcomes. But I'm not really sure beyond that if there will be a huge deep dive. For this committee, I think there's a lot of other spaces that makes more sense for this committee to dive into, but we'll definitely keep you informed as this program evolves. And Ken and Audrey are both engaged in this in different ways, as well as OWEB staff person Heidi Hartman, who's really helped me a lot with the SIA restoration grants. Questions or anything to add?
Yeah, Courtney, I would, for this committee, just add, along with, you mentioned the managers meeting, representatives from those same agencies, so OWEB, ODA, ODFW, and DEQ, along with a representative from OSU Extension, have a collaborative monitoring and assessment group that, in addition to helping advise on the monitoring efforts for the SIAs, also provides some guidance from those agencies, for example, DEQ guidance, ODFW guidance, to help inform their monitoring. So that aligns with kind of that interagency collaborative approach to watershed monitoring.
Thanks, Audrey.
It's can't function for some reason, so I'm just jumping in. Stepping up for ODF&W.
Mark, I heard you say ODF&W, but the rest of it was garbled.
Okay, sorry. I told them my hand function doesn't show on here, so I don't know. Who is the rep from ODF&W on that strategic implementation?
Yep. Becky Anthony is our primary contact. And then Audrey, who's the other person? Spencer?
Spencer Sawaski.
Thank you. Yep.
And ODF&W participates on what we call the local teams. So that's integral to these SIAs. So depending on who the ODF&W active in that watershed, the SWCD engages them to informs their SIA approach.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah.
All right, Stephanie, I think the next slide is yours.
Great. So these next two slides are not about grant programs, but they are about two buckets of work where we often engage with the board, and that relates to communicating and reporting the results and outcomes of OWEB's grant investment work. So I've got a slide focused on communications and then a slide focused on reporting. So again, this isn't a grant program, but it's really important to us collectively to be able to communicate the results and the outcomes of OWEB grant investments. And so we've got some internal resources. We have, as you all know, our fabulous publications coordinator, Linda, helps amplify local grantee information and communications around the results of projects that OWEB invests in. And then we also partner, in addition to grantees, with other agencies such as Lottery to help amplify the outcomes of OWEB investments and amplify communications. So in terms of things to talk through with the committee, I think just sharing all the ways that we are currently partnering with grantees and other agencies and internally to share information about OWEB investments would be helpful. Have some dialogue with the committee on additional partners that might help us get the message out about some of the work that local grantees do and that OWEB funds. And then also sharing progress with you and gathering feedback on the work to implement the strategic plan elements that have a communication nexus. And we do have strategic plan priority 1 that has a pretty significant body of communications work captured in there that we'll be reporting on an ongoing basis. So before I go to the next slide, I'll pause and see if anybody has anything to add or any questions about communications.
But if I may, Stephanie, we do work, again, it's internally, right? Like, so after these, we heard, these investments in effectiveness monitoring also often come out with dense scientific reports that describe outcomes from restoration actions. And then we do try to distill that using our webpage. There's effectiveness monitoring webpage, but also just working with partners to communicate that out. And so disseminating scientific results is challenging, and we don't have dedicated staff for that, but Audrey and I try to work on that on the heels of these completed investments in effectiveness monitoring. And for instance, the I&W report that we presented to you guys in October with partners is an example of trying to do that. Thank you.
Ken? Great. And I can't see if anyone else has their hands raised, so apologies, but
I don't see any stuff.
okay, great.
I'll track for you.
Okay, next slide. Great. Okay, then the other big bucket of work that is primarily tackled with OWEB internal resources is reporting. And I'm going to advance my own version here to make sure I've got my notes handy. There we go. So reporting is a mix of activities. We've got a lot of statutorily required reporting that we do. For example, the Oregon Plan biennial report and our annual key performance measures report that I think we've shared with the board a few times. There's other reports such as the tribal engagement report that we do every year, the report to the Environmental Justice Council. So we do a lot of reporting. We also elect to do reports sometimes that aren't necessarily required, but are a communication and reporting pathway. And then we've also got other data resources that I wouldn't call a report, but that are available to share information about OWEB investments. And so an example of that is the investment tracking tool, and that's available online where folks can go and look at investments that OWEB has made in a particular area of the state and do some different geographically based queries there. So a whole bunch of different resources are rolled into here. Another piece of behind the scenes reporting that our reporting efforts involve is to federal funding partners on the outcomes of the investments that OWEB administers on their behalf. So for example, Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Funds and the Farm Bill Technical Assistance Funds. So again, the reporting work is not a grant program, although it connects very closely with the grant investments that OWEB administers. So some of the areas where we might want to engage the committee with regard to reporting, including sharing some of the reported statistics with you from our key performance measures. If we're seeing something go in a particular direction, it might be something we want to noodle with the committee about why we're seeing things go in the direction that they are. It's helpful to have direction from the committee about the reporting format that we're providing to you and the level of information. So for example, on the strategic plan reporting, it's good to have some dialogue about what's a digestible level of information that also shows you how we're making progress on some of the plan elements. And then one area that we'll specifically ask your input on is to help inform the Oregon Plan Biennial Report. There are some statutorily required elements of the report about kind of the board weighing in on some things. And so we'll ask you for your feedback on that as we get closer to preparing that report that's due every 2 years. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to cover in this area. And so again, anybody want to add anything or any questions?
Yeah, Stephanie, briefly, I would just add to the list. There's some collaborative work that staff do with the focused investment partnerships around progress tracking reporting as well.
That's a great one. Thanks, Audrey. And one other elective report that we do that I'll mention is we create every year county fact sheets that show OWEB investments in each county. I know that's an area that the board often asks about, is kind of how much have we invested in a particular area of the state. So it's something that we report as part of the Oregon Plan Biennial Report. And then we've also got county fact sheets available on our website at any given time. So the 2023 ones are already up on our website. And so just so folks know that those are available too. And I think this is another area where we could do just an overview of what the universe of reporting looks like, if that's something that would ever be helpful.
Yeah, Steph, and I don't know if this will help bridge into the next section or pull us in the opposite direction, but I do want to note, I don't know how many folks had a chance to see the budget presentation that Steph and I did to our Joint Ways and Means Committee a couple of weeks ago, I guess it was. One of the questions we got was, and very friendly, but like, this is a lot of investment the state is making. How do we know that this is landing, that it's having the intended outcomes? Like this, this is something that we hear a lot from legislators and from, the general public and others that are interested in OWEB's work. But I think it's really relevant as we think about this program of work to think like, how do we not just sort of respond to that in the moment, but get ahead of that question and be able to demonstrate? And I saw the board, honestly, in our last meeting, as we started talking about, what was it? Telling the restoration story? Sort of wavering on this point of a deep dive into a strategic communications conversation. And I felt the pull myself. I was like, oh yeah, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about both kind of the importance of a strategic communications approach and also just the reality of being an agency that does our work through other people's work and has a single fully dedicated communications person. And that's what caused us, honestly, to rethink this committee a little bit. We were already excited to dive into sort of some of the content that Courtney will talk about next as kind of a deep dive in our monitoring programs. But I think there is an additional step there of I saw the board really hungry for a conversation about a strategic approach to kind of how do monitoring and reporting and external communications add up to, making the case for why OWEB investments are important and what they achieve on the ground. And I know I myself was partially ready to dive into that and partially remember our actual capacity in this world and how limited it is. So that's kind of where we stuck a bunch of the, strategic communications questions and thoughts that Stephanie just flagged. And I think we'll continue on in the next section, but really relish the opportunity to spend time with a smaller group of the board to be able to deep dive and kind of report back and fast forward and bring those conversations to the full board when the time is right.
So I actually missed that meeting. How did you answer that question?
You missed the meeting where I answered that question?
Yeah.
Do you mean the question on how do we track outcomes, Mark, of our investments? Let's see. I can start as Sarah to add on.
We went very much to style. Stephanie had a good, pragmatic, solid, and well-informed answer, and then I had a philosophical sort of off-the-cuff answer, and I think hopefully that was a good tag team approach. But you're talking about in our Joint Ways and Means presentation, Mark, that I just flagged. You're really hard to hear, Mark. I know I can see you trying to use the mic, but it looked like you were nodding. Steph, your answer was much more substantive. Why don't you say what you said first?
Okay, and I think if I recall, the question was, how do you guys make sure that your investments sustain themselves? Or
how do we know it's a lasting impact?
How do you know it's a
not
lasting
just
impact?
You remove some weeds and then they come back the next year.
Exactly. So I think there's several different strategies that we use is where I would start with that. I think we've moved in a direction of funding projects that are good at sustaining themselves. I think that's one thing I would say is and I think that's referred to as process-based restoration. So beaver dam analogs and things like that can in a lot of ways sustain themselves. And then if they kind of melt away, that was the way they were designed. So but the watershed is healthier than when we started. So I think that's one thing. Or yeah, if we're looking at a streamside restoration project, is the planting plan such that the vegetation's gonna be so healthy that it outcompetes weeds and that it will sustain itself and remain on the landscape? So I think those are some of the things that we look at the project design phase. We also have reporting and engagement with the grantee during the life of the grant and even beyond in terms of how is the project doing at the individual project level. And then we have, as Courtney talked about, the more programmatic or global, let's take a look at this collection of grant investments in a particular area or a particular program, and how well are they doing a few years later? What are some of the lessons we can learn that help make those projects work better in the future?
Thanks, Steph. Brian?
Yeah, I think this is a really good conversation. I think it would be good to have it written out and maybe some sort of visual to communicate around this and what are we trying to achieve. And I've taught classes internationally on ecological monitoring and stuff like that, and trying to there's a lot of questions that get asked, and the first most important question is, are we doing what we say we're doing in the ways that we say we're doing? And actually Stephanie hit the first question, which is, are we doing the right treatments in the right places? That kind of stuff. So that's kind of you have the implementation domain, but then are we getting the outcomes that we wanted? That's a harder question to answer, that takes more investments, more time, and therefore we need to do it in fewer places. So trying to lay that out in a way, and maybe I think when I've tried to explain this to the public or policymakers, a lot of times I think medical analogies are good, right? We don't ask doctors regular practitioners, GPs, to do experiments and answer like, okay, that prescription that you just gave someone is, has that been proven in a clinical trial or we want you to do a clinical trial for all of your patients. It's like, no, we have people that do those very detailed studies, and then we use those results to actually inform what those general practitioners are prescribing and those kinds of things. And so I think if we treat it in that way, where these expectations that all projects ought to be able to do some type of monitoring around, we're doing effective practices that are thoughtfully delivered and they're being implemented properly, and we have some near-term kind of outcome or expectations around the outcomes, but then we make some longer-term investments, perhaps through longitudinal studies, to show over time, we are getting these outcomes that we expected from, this person's blood pressure is going down and it's consistent with those clinical trials kind of thing. And then we have other things that are looking at novel treatments that truly are kind of like clinical trials. And that's kind of some of the value reset stuff that OWEB has done. So it sounds to me like all those pieces are here as far as the OWEB's programs that you just communicated. I think the one thing that would be nice is to kind of lay that out in a structured way that communicates those pieces that are pretty digestible by, policymakers, like what Sarah was asking, is like, well, how are we making these investments in ways, and are we getting what we want? And I just think maybe that's already been done. I just wonder if there's an opportunity to kind of step back and tell that big story across the whole portfolio that we just went through here.
I'll go to Brian and Audrey here in a minute. Brian, thanks for that analogy. That was just really great. And I think you really lead us into like the second half of the conversation today at the board committee is, what are the one-on-ones? Where are the deep dives? Where should we spend some time with this committee talking about that? And I think like working towards a graphic that can talk about these different levels of investments and what we're trying to achieve with them is a perfect elevation to dig into this with this committee. A long outdated document, I'm not sure if I want to use outdated, but a previously adopted document by the board was our long-term investment strategy, which we have not revisited for a really long time. And there is a graphic part of that document that shows like effectiveness monitoring is supposed to be kind of like an underlying theme of all of our programs to make sure that we are like kind of evaluating and assessing our programs and monitoring at the programmatic level as appropriate, and then doing, more, doing monitoring at the site-specific project level when that's appropriate. But I'll turn it to Ken and then Audrey.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It's the vision that you just sort of described, right? It's the long game and the different pieces, and we do have all those. And I think it's just how do we communicate that succinctly or let people see that vision that we have and where we're trying to invest our time and resources. We also work with several different state and federal agencies on this. We're not the only ones curious and need to do this. And you guys are all partners. We also are partners in the great state of Washington. We communicate with and have in the past co-invested. And certainly there's IMWs across Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, for instance. And then also the Bonneville Power Administration. We are often a big co-funder together in salmon restoration projects, and they are often very interested in this. And so I just want to say we're not alone in this, and we're learning alongside all of our partners, and all that creates that institutional knowledge and understanding, like where do we have confidence in these treatments, and then where do we need to invest additional in these novel treatments as they emerge. So thank you.
Yeah, and just building on that, much of what was presented so far that we're kind of building or talking about, the Oregon plan itself, and then that Oregon plan biennial report, the interagency work that's being done to convene and advise on monitoring, through the Oregon Plan Monitoring Team, strategic implementation areas, and the focused investment partnerships. I just wanted to build on that and emphasize that all of that is interagency work, and that we know that we're not alone. We welcome and are excited about the role for collaboration and feel like there's a great structure to build on that collaboration. And just to also recognize that it does take time to see those water quality outcomes and those habitat outcomes on the ground, that takes time, and it takes the effort of other agencies and partners, as well as OWEB's role as a grantor.
I really like where you guys are headed with this. I see this as the right committee for this moment. And Courtney, how about if you step into the next section here, and I think jump on the segue that Brian offered, because I do think if we can get this committee really understanding how the pieces of that monitoring and reporting and tracking and communicating puzzle fit together, then I bet that you guys can help us figure out, to Brian's point, how to sort of communicate that, not just to the rest of the board, but to the broader community. So if we can get you guys' heads there in the next couple meetings, we'll be doing pretty well, I think.
Yeah, so we, the last part of this agenda here was, future work planning for this committee. And we have, I don't know, Ken, maybe a year we've been talking off and on about bringing a monitoring 101 to the full board. I think, especially based on the evolving quantifying outputs and outcomes category, also a 101 for that. And I think based on this conversation that we've been having today, in my mind, it's kind of evolving into probably a monitoring 101 demonstrating the different elevations at which we're monitoring and how they all the puzzle pieces fit together. And as Liz has a great graphic from open solicitation, like why here, why now? And I think that is an important conversation to have in any program where we're talking about investments. And I could imagine at our next committee meeting, bringing to this committee kind of maybe a draft graphic, working with Amazing Linda, so we don't have just plain white slides, and just walking through our different investments, examples of previous investments, things that are queued up that we're thinking about for next biennium, and just talking about how all those puzzle pieces fit together, and asking all of you for if you see any gaps in those pieces, things that we're not investing in, or things that that are on the horizon that we should be paying attention to. How does that sound? Brian?
Yeah, no, that sounds great. The one thing I would encourage is to include, the assessment piece in this, because I think sometimes we want to focus on monitoring like it's something you do at the back end of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, back to the medical analogy, if the first thing is a good diagnosis from our general practitioner about whether the patient is healthy, and if not, what parts need some attention, and that results in the prescription that you receive. And then everything else flows from that. Like, are we implementing that stuff? Are we following all the guidelines for using that prescription, that particular treatment? And then everything else follows from that. So I want to make sure we include that assessment thing at that kind of beginning of that whole process, because it's so critical.
Thanks, Brian. Nicole?
Yeah, I'm going to be the voice of our technically challenged Mark right now. He definitely gives his support for an OWEB for a monitoring 101. It's a great idea. We have a bunch of new board members, as well as new representatives for non-government organizations, things like that.
Great, thank you.
Ken has his hand up, Courtney. I can see you're looking at your other screen to think.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm really, like Sarah said, I'm super excited for this committee. We missed our monitoring committee and glad it's come back. And it's just a conversation. And so the assessment is a key piece. We have funding, we didn't even talk about that, but we have a whole grant, offering for that technical assistance. And there's been so much assessment and continues to be, again, with all of our partners, right? Our grantees aren't doing it alone. And so trying to include that is an important piece. How to land on that elevation will be interesting. And so I just appreciate you bringing that up, because that is exactly what drives the restoration that our partners are prioritizing.
There
Without-
was a robust debate among OWEB managers about which of these committees the technical assistance grants should land in, because they like set the stage for restoration and acquisitions. They help build partnerships and capacity, the second committee. And, you know, Courtney, I think, didn't dive into that fray, and maybe was happy with the committee that she already has. But Brian's making me wonder, like, maybe this is a better place for that. So I think that would be totally fair game to kind of build that into the arc of our, you know, understanding of the way that we do tracking and communicating here. And then we can see if we want to steal them from whichever other committee they landed in at some point. But I mean, it's a really important lens that I hadn't thought about that body of work through. I appreciate the insight. Steph?
One other thing, this is going to be kind of a half-baked thought because that's been just rattling around in my head as we've been talking, but I think monitoring and assessment is one of those areas where there are lots of other partners out doing it as well. And I think just some of the questions that I've heard like brought up, or kind of some of the themes I'm hearing, some of those partners are also such a critical role in answering those questions. So just like, is the Oregon plan achieving what we hoped it would when it was envisioned 25 years ago? I think that's like a multi-agency conversation. Is water quality getting better? Are wildlife populations getting better? Are fish populations getting better? And we have a lot of partners that gather data on an ongoing basis outside of OWEB's grant making to help answer those questions. But then some of the grant making that we provide also helps answer those questions. I think another one that I hear a lot is how much of the state is in good condition and how much is still in need of restoration. Like, how far have we moved the needle collectively as funding agencies and land management agencies and so forth. And so, yeah, it's like there's just a lot of pieces to answer that puzzle. And some of them we support with our grant making, and then some of them other folks are doing.
Thanks, Steph.
Board members, any other kind of additional thoughts or requests for the team as we start thinking about our agenda for the next couple of meetings and what might go into a monitoring 101 in particular here? People we should be talking to that we're not already.
And I would say one of the things that we have brought to the full board in the past, and maybe this board, this committee can brainstorm a little bit, is typically once a biennium, we work with ODF&W to talk about the PCSRF funding we give to ODF&W to do monitoring and what are they, what are the things they're tracking, how they're using those funds. So we can definitely, discuss with this board, what are the things maybe from what ODF&W is working on that we should bring to the full board for a presentation. Jesse?
Oh, I'm guessing this will probably already be part of the whatever presentation you put together, but just, providing examples of what OWEB has funded to those different monitoring tiers. So like if you are doing, it's some of the examples that Ken maybe talked through earlier on the call, but just giving people a sense of like, okay, if we're looking at outcomes, this is the kind of studies that we funded, and it's specifically around this question. Or if it's around assessment, it's, specifically around, like, here's a couple of examples and the kind of information it gives our grantees or gives us. And so being clear to show like what the different things that have been funded or what the different just component, different monitoring aims, I don't know what you want to call them, but like examples to demonstrate that.
Thanks, Jesse. I've already got a graphic in my head. If Linda could just see it and make it become reality.
I find that when I sit near Linda, she can usually see the graphic that's in my head. I don't know how she does it. Jesse, you got a thumbs up from Brian, and then Brian, I saw put a note in the chat as well that I don't know if everybody can see, just kind of focusing on watershed and ecological processes and
Yeah,
Brian, actually, do you want to say that? I lost the grammatical structure of the sentence there as I was trying to summarize it.
Yeah, it was mentioned that people argue, reasonably have the questions like, how's our water quality? How's our fish population doing? How's our wild? I think that's a really good question. That's really why we're all here, right? But, I think, and it's a subtle, but I think in a really important nuance that we focus on how are the processes that sustain those resources kind of functioning is a more tractable problem, and it focuses us towards the solutions, which is restoring those processes rather than just the populations themselves. And it's also more answerable because well, in some ways it's more challenging, but those processes are, should respond sooner to our treatments than the resources themselves. And it helps emphasize that we want to restore those self-sustaining processes that we just talked about earlier, that is really what we're about. So it's a little bit of a nuance in communications, but I think it's an important one.
Brian, I wish you'd been in our Ways and Means presentation. That would have been a good answer too.
Yeah, because honestly, like you could be doing a good job on the restoration front and still not be seeing the populations respond because of natural variability or because there's those big lags between when actions get taken and when, and so that's where I think we have to establish reasonable expectations around what kinds of questions can get asked and answered at what spatial scales and over what time scales. And the population stuff is big and long. And sometimes people aren't always patient to answer or to wait till we get those answers to big and long. And so we need to keep our eye on the big and long, but at the same time, answer things on shorter time scales and smaller spatial scales that are tied to those interests or those resources.
Ken, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean that's not easy stuff that Brian's talking about, you guys, and I'm not sure we're equipped to answer that question at this time. I think that we are working with very sophisticated partners that are trying to understand what are some things they can measure to better understand if those restoration actions are impacting self-sustaining processes based on their treatments that they're performing. And there's a lot of brain power going into that, on like say this large scale floodplain restoration efforts. And so I think people are moving in that direction. But if you were to say that, except for every watershed in Oregon, do we know if that's happening? And are our investments moving the dial on it? It would be not easy question to answer at this time.
Yeah, just as a clarification, I think if we cast those questions in the context of that whole cycle of robust science-based assessment, prescription, that whole thing, I do think that we can make the case that if we do the right diagnoses, the right prescriptions, we track whether we're implementing those prescriptions, and in some places track the efficacy of those kind of longitudinally, and then do some of the clinical trial stuff, before, after, control impact stuff. I think you can collectively kind of answer that question to some degree. So that's what I was meaning. I wasn't trying to create some undoable kind of framework or questions.
Thanks. Audrey?
Yeah, and I'll be super brief here, but just to give a kind of build on what Ken and Brian have just talked about real specifically, for the focused investment partnership, there is a theory of change that's part of the reporting and progress tracking for that effort. And so Courtney and others, maybe that's something that could be discussed at a future presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Audrey.
I like that idea.
Well, I think we have some good topics to
Mark's
build.
trying to talk and we can't hear you again, Mark. Sorry. No. You want to send it to Nicole again? I'm sorry. That's what you get for going on vacation. Your technology went on vacation too. They know you shouldn't be working. Let's give Mark just a second. I think he looks like he's typing here. Claire?
I just wanted to say I find this conversation really interesting just because this is like a space NRCS really struggles. You know, it's technically part of our planning process is that kind of monitoring piece at the end, but in actuality, it doesn't happen. And kind of for me mentally, how this like feeds back into kind of some of the earlier conversation about like the communication and kind of almost like the success story is what we call it. I supervise our public affairs team and we make success stories, but it's how do we get them to the audience that like it's meaningful for? And that's some of like for this agency is some of that monitoring type work, really the audience, things like effectiveness don't necessarily, ecological effectiveness aren't meaningful. They understand things that are acres treated. And so as an agency, we've like totally just been like, well, we can say we've done X number of this. And I don't know. So anyways, I'm just sharing like this hits on like everything I do on a daily basis and like struggle with mentally. So it's very reassuring to hear other people are having the same like thoughts going through their heads all the time.
Thanks, Claire. I'm so glad we snagged you for this committee because I do think you guys are kind of our big sister in a lot of this. I think figuring out how to fit that communications and reporting and tracking role alongside a grant making role so that one doesn't eat the other, but they kind of mutually support each other, I think is an interesting challenge. And sooner or later, you keep reporting acres treated, some legislator will ask you too, what happens to those acres after they're treated? So it's good to have our thought processes together so we can develop some shared thinking and messaging around that. Did we get a question from Mark? I see that he is trying to talk again. Sorry, Mark. It's not working. Courtney, did you get what you needed from members here to be able to move forward?
This was
great
a
conversation.
great conversation. I'm so excited to be engaging with all of you. Claire, I'm glad we found the right landing spot for you. It seems perfect. And so I think I'll pass the baton to you, Sarah, to facilitate the co-chair.
Well, I would, and I'm sitting here thinking about this, and I'm thinking, gosh, we already have Mark serving on a board and 2 commissions, and we have 2 federal members and 1 federally funded researcher that probably you guys are dealing with some workforce impacts right now, and it might be a little bit hard for you to know your bandwidth for the rest of the year. So what I would suggest is, how about if we take the co-chair nomination process to email? If you guys think you're interested and not sure about bandwidth, if you're interested in co-chairing, like whatever your parameters might be, shoot me an email. I'll, check in with Nicole and check in with our board co-chairs and see if we can propose a process, or not a process, but a pair of co-chairs that have kind of the right balance of interest and bandwidth. And then we can circle back as well with Liza Jane and Jamie and see what the right fit is. But I think the other committees, are heading towards, one co-chair that has more bandwidth and one co-chair that has a lot of interest, but not so sure about bandwidth. And I suspect we can probably arrange something like this for this committee too. And it really is not a huge lift. But we know that sometimes folks have to miss a committee meeting, and that's why we have co-chairs, even despite having a relatively small number of committee members. Then we know somebody can make it and come and chair the meeting. And as we've seen, if we don't have a co-chair, then if all else fails, then I can occasionally facilitate a meeting too. But let's just take that offline. Let's give folks their 13 minutes back here unless folks have anything else for the good of the order. And I will just encourage members to reach out if you're interested in a co-chair role, and we'll talk about it and bring it back to the full board. And our next meeting of this committee will be in June. Courtney and the team will be thinking through how much education to try to cram in all of our heads and how much discussion at that meeting. And I'm going to be there because I have a lot of learning to do in this area too. And so I appreciate this committee too, because it gives me a chance to dig into a part of the agency and our work that I was less familiar with when I was outside the agency, because I never got a monitoring or a reporting grant. So I don't know as much about those programs. So.
Well, thanks.
Courtney and team, thanks so much for your time today and walking us through. Nicole, you look like you have something else that I should say before I let class out.
Nope. I just wanted to say specifically, it's June 11th is when our next meeting is, just to have it on the record.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay. Members, partners, thanks so much for your time. Really great. Look forward to digging into this topic together starting in June.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.